you can see, Beaverland, how one weird rodent made America. And this is, as it were, a reprise of a conversation that Leila and I had, and we promise you it's going to be very different. So for those of you who are at the book launch in Hudson at the Opera House, we will do a very different conversation. But so I read this book before it had come out, and I was blown away, because this is a piece of scholarship that is well written, engaging. It's as much about the people who love beavers, the people who hunt beavers, the people who made their fortunes on beavers, and social history of America as it is about beavers, but it is intrinsically about beavers. And so Leila has written one other book about her family farm in the Hudson Valley up in Columbia County. And this book is really exceptional because it blends natural history and social history in a way that is, I would say, unusual, but that understates it. So it is a great pleasure to be here again. And I will find any excuse I can to sit for an hour and talk with Leila about Beaverland. So thank you very much for coming, and we will start our conversation. Where is Leila? Hiding behind the palm tree. Phew. So, the joke is that she threatened to make me do it on my own, right? And it was like, no. Hi, what do we have? Okay. My microphone was upside down. Could you guys hear me? Okay. And you guys, I hope, I'm not pointing at you, I'm pointing at the camera. I hope you could hear me. Anyway, welcome to Cary Institute.
Thank you so much. I guess I should make sure you can hear me okay? Great, because I'm not supposed to touch this little box. I have to leave it right here.
And we're not allowed to get up because then we drag
Yeah.
across the landscape.
Well, before you ask your question, I just have to say thank you so much for having me here. It is such an honor to be at Cary, really, truly. And thank you all for coming out. So let's get our Beaver conversation going.
So, you know, I mentioned before that your book is a tour de force, and, you know, it encapsulates a few centuries of the intersections of people and beavers. But what I'm really interested is, you know, how did you go from just loving beavers to being writing such a deft social history of beavers in America?
Wow. Okay. So that's like a really great question.
It's a big question.
It's a big question.
So you can answer it any way you want.
Well, I'm really flattered that you call me a social historian. I don't think of myself that way, but you're absolutely right. I wanted to give all of you, all my readers, a really deep look at beavers because they did make this country, and they have fascinated humans since Pliny the Elder, and probably before that. But and I had such an incredible journey learning about them. I would meet a man who spends all his time tracking them through the woods. I would meet a woman who, well, actually I would meet her on the page, but I would learn about this woman who lived in the southern Adirondacks with 14 beavers in her house, a tiny little house. Seriously, spent her entire life with beavers. That's how much she loved beavers. A man whose code name is the Beaver Whisperer in the Chesapeake, who has really done an incredible job using beavers to really revolutionize environmental restoration in that part of the world. And I could go on, including America's first multimillionaire who got his start. He was a millionaire by age 27, thanks to the beaver. But I want to just step back maybe and share an anecdote, because when you were talking about my first book, it got me thinking about growing up on and off a farm in the Hudson Valley. And, you know, one of the great gifts of growing up on a farm is you're often bored and hot. And seriously, remembering those times when you have nothing to do, and actually that means you have everything to do. Don't we all remember those times? But we were often down at the pond, and I was obsessed with frogs and trying to swim around with them. And I think they fascinated me because they were these creatures that we could be with for a little while because they could come on land, but then they would go into their water world where you can only be with creatures of the water for a little while, and then you can't be with them anymore. And it occurs to me that beavers are kind of like that too. They're these mysterious creatures that come on land for a while and then disappear back into the water. And I think that's part of why they've fascinated the human imagination for so long. But beavers really literally made this country, and it was the lust for beaver fur that brought the first explorers here, jump-started transatlantic trade, revved up the engines of capitalism in the 19th century. John Jacob
Company.
Yeah, John Jacob Astor. I'm conflating my American history, but seriously, you can just go on and on about beavers in American history, but it's not just that. What I would learn researching the book was the extent to which beavers made the land, because they shaped the river system to the large extent that when you imagine Beaverland, when 400 million beaver, imagine 400 million beaver living on this continent in the river system, shaping the way water moves, which is they slow it down, they spread it out. Back when rivers were these arteries pulsing water and life through the land, and beavers are managing that. They literally shaped the way water moved through the land. They literally then shaped the land. So, I mean, that's pretty, literally they shaped America.
Right. And that is something that I think my colleague Clive Jones and colleagues of his coined a term 25 years ago called ecosystem engineers.
Yes, I mean.
We're going to go to ecosystem
Yeah,
engineers.
I mean, we kind of skipped over humans in.
Oh, you want to go back to that?
I just want to go back for a
Can we
second,
go
because
back, please?
just for a second, because I think it is so fun
There we go.
to think about all these misunderstandings about the animal.
All right.
And we just have to just spend a minute about the beaver, Castor canadensis. So you've got this bear-like face, winsome bear-like face, these amazing hands with their 5 nimble fingers. What beavers can do with their hands is just amazing. I had wanted to get wildlife camera footage, but we just couldn't figure out how to get the technology to work. But to see them manipulating twigs and sticks is unbelievable. And we'll get into in the next slide what they can build. But what's interesting is because humans have been able to observe what beavers can do, what they can build, but rarely observe the animal themselves. And we'll get into this later. The kind of fantastic ideas about the beaver have been something I chart in the book and have a lot of fun with. So 13th century, 15th century, 16th century, it doesn't get much better than that. They were blue and looked like serpents. They looked like crocodiles. They looked like bobcats. They really went all over the place. But the beaver itself as an animal,
So you don't have to strain your neck. I printed it out.
is incredible. And the beaver's weirdest feature has to be the tail. So this reptilian tail that looks like it's been run over by a tractor tire or something, flattened out, right? Actually is an incredible feature anatomically. So it's the beaver's refrigerator in winter. They live off fat stored in the tail. In the summer, it's their cooling system. It's the tail that actually cools the beaver because there's so many blood vessels in the tail. It's a highly calibrated water sensor. So that tail enables the beaver to detect very minute changes in water pressure. So that's why when anybody breaks a beaver dam, the beavers are there, snap, and they get to the beaver dam and they repair it because they can feel the water pressure, the water going down. They don't have to see it happening. They can feel it. And there are other aspects. The tail is a prop. When they're on land, they sit back on their tail. Maybe some of you have seen it. When they're swimming, it's a rudder. It's pretty incredible, even though it's got to be the weirdest looking thing.
Yeah.
So anyway, now we can go to the slide you wanted to do.
I love the sort of the visual image of you can see what they built, but you can't see them.
Well, I think this is part of the mystery of the beaver. It's certainly for me. I mean, when I skipped over this, but the way I got into this book was by accident. I was just walking in the woods one day with my dog. In fact, it was my dog Coda who saw the beavers first. And we were walking, my dog froze. I didn't know what she was looking at. And then I heard this crack. I thought a gun had gone off, but sure enough, it was a beaver warning me, telling me to go away. And then I saw the water, and then I saw all the trees had come down, the water was coming up. It was the most amazing thing I'd ever seen. And that was the beginning.
Crack a tail.
That was a tail flap. That was her
Tail
warning.
Right.
You know, and I called her a she later, talking to Dr. Glynis Hood, who's one of the leading, you know, beaver researchers up in Canada. She said, oh yeah, it probably was a female because it's the females that come out in the evening to inspect the dam. So
Of
anyway,
course.
so I was right,
There you
even
go.
though I knew nothing about beavers at that time.
All right, so I'll go back to Clive and.
Yeah, let's go.
and
Now we can progress.
Ecosystem
Yeah.
engineers. I mean, the idea came about, and beavers really are the prima facie case for what an ecosystem engineer could be, right?
Yes.
But it came about because Clive and John Lawton and some other people he was working with realized that we're not the only people who alter the landscape. And so, you know, I'm trying to make sure. So talk to me about how beavers do that and
Yeah.
what their sort of role is. You mentioned earlier that they spread the water out, but can we, pardon me, dive a little deeper into that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there's so much to say. And this, I think I have to just lean over and
That's
look at this slide with you all. So on the, first of all, the ecosystem engineer, they are, I believe, the only animal apart from man who creates the environment they need to live. So beavers need water. Lucky for us. I mean, water is the story of our century. Too much water, too little water. So all the problems we're facing with climate change, beavers can help us dramatically. And I hope we have some time to talk about that as
Yeah.
we go forward, because this is what's also tremendously exciting about beavers right now, and was for me one of the great things about writing this book right now that I really discovered and wanted to share with readers is that here's this rodent, we nearly wiped it out. Thank goodness we didn't. Thank goodness smart people at the right time brought beavers back at the beginning of the 1900s. So they're one of our greatest North American conservation success stories that we can own. And now beavers are here to help us if we let them, if we get smart about it. But to go back to this slide, so beavers manage water. They store it, they cleanse it, they slow it down. So the slide on the left is actually a beaver dam that I've watched beavers making right near my home in the last 12 weeks. That's a very, very new beaver dam. The largest animal construction on Earth is a beaver dam.
Half a mile long.
Yep.
Yeah.
Twice as long, I think, as the Hoover Dam in northern Alberta. So that's in Connecticut in the east. The one on the right is a good example of what beavers will do, because they will move to a stream or a creek or a small river. They'll make one dam, they'll move downstream, they'll make another, and then they'll make another, and they'll make another. So it's never just a one-off, one beaver pond. They'll make a succession of ponds. So pretty soon, and you can see it in that slide, that stream or creek is a succession of dams, which means it's a succession of ponds, which means pretty soon the water is moving laterally. And there's a tremendous amount of connectivity created between the water and the land. So in that slide right there, I put some of the statistics that I think are really quite stunning. The water that you see in a beaver pond, on average, is about 1 million gallons, but it's at least 2.5 times as much water being held underneath. That's pretty phenomenal to think that each beaver pond that you see has a kind of invisible sponge of water underneath being held. That's a huge resource of water. It means also that when a massive storm event comes, you've got a huge arena of sponge ready to sop up floodwater, which is why, in a counterintuitive way, beavers they flood and they create areas of water which not just create water reservoirs, but create flood control. And I think this is sometimes hard for people to understand until you start to think about the underground water storage that they're creating, because even a wet sponge holds water, if you think about it that way. So the value that they give to river systems by making them more connected to the land around them is really profound.
And I remember in the book, you talked about how our perception of what a river is,
Yeah,
right, is a beaver-free river, right? A river that has banks and is flowing in its stream and it's
Yeah.
in its channel, as it were, we use that expression, but that a natural system with beavers looks really different.
yeah. I mean, I had the great opportunity to go up into the White Mountains, into the Hubbard Brook, forest.
Experimental forest.
Yes.
Yes, and anyone who doesn't know, Cary Institute has been working at Hubbard Brook before we were Cary Institute. Gene Likens, our founding president, started work there, discovered acid rain there, but he started his work in the early 60s. So we have a very long relationship. So when I was reading Leila's book and I saw 2 chapters, I think, on
Yes.
Hubbard Brook and beavers and what happens in the Hubbard Brook forest, I thought, wow, there's a convergence, right?
Yeah.
So,
Well, it was really exciting to go up there because Dr. Berkstead, researcher I follow her around the Yale Forest in Union near where I live, and also up in the White Mountains. She's studying rivers that have been worked by beavers for about 70 years. And she's really interested in this question of what did rivers look like pre-colonization? Because if we're trying to restore rivers, what are we trying to restore them to is the question.
Right.
And we really only have rivers that have been so degraded and devastated by all the environmental impacts of colonization and by having had beavers removed. So you can start to see the river up here. We don't see many rivers that look like this anymore. We just really don't. And that's what,
they're like a terraced
Yeah.
structure.
yeah.
Right.
And the water goes out
Right.
and it's dynamic.
And so the forest itself gets flooded gently.
Yeah.
Right.
And it's not just connecting water to land. There's a lot of ecological connectivity that comes with that because all kinds of species move out with that water, right? And then can
Change
be
the forest.
connected. Yeah. So,
And that really is, when you say Beaverland, that is almost what Beaverland is.
well, that's what Dr. Berkstead, I think, might call something that's starting to appear like a paleo river.
Okay.
So, but we don't know what these river systems look like because we've never seen them.
Right. So can we shift gears a little bit?
Let's go forward. Yeah.
And talk about people for a second? And, there are a couple people we're going to sort of focus on. One who was deeply analytical and an anthropologist and a social scientist before we called them social scientists, but who also loved beavers, and that's Louis Henry Morgan.
Yeah.
And can we talk a little bit about his history and his mapping of beaver ponds and what he
Yeah.
discovered? Because his book was one of the earliest books on beaver ecology.
Yeah, well, one of the things I realized researching this book was that I really needed to understand the way rivers worked myself.
Mhm.
And then I really wanted to share that with the reader, with all of you. So these 2 slides are from his book, The American Beaver, that he published in 1868. But what's really interesting about Louis Henry Morgan is that he was an industrialist. He was a railroad man, and he was out in Michigan with his friends, the railroad barons, as a lawyer, trout fishing. And he came upon all these beaver works and he was fascinated by them. And so he started documenting what he realized were some of the last vestiges of Beaverland, but he didn't really understand the value of these beavers to the environment. He just thought they were fantastic and fascinating from a kind of constructive point of view. And then he became fascinated by the idea of beaver intelligence,
Mhm.
because he said, how could a little rodent do this? These massive structures, and is it just instinct? He started asking this question and there was no information really about it. So in his book, there's this interesting question about what is beaver intelligence that ripples through that he never answers.
Right.
But he did an incredible service by documenting all these beaver dams, and here's the map of them. And I would take this map out to Michigan, and actually I would find two of his beaver ponds, and they still existed. And the Grass Lake Dam still existed, which meant it was almost 200 years old. And it was still being maintained by beavers, which means that not only are these animals able to build very large structures, they're maintaining them throughout the generations, which is really interesting.
Yeah.
And it would lead me to the next chapter where I actually interview a researcher at Harvard who has, I think, begun to crack the code on beaver intelligence by thinking about it in terms of a collective intelligence rather than just the individual intelligence of one
And
animal.
cultural transmission of that knowledge generation to generation.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but I think it is really interesting, and researchers have studied, many people have studied Morgan's map and gone back and looked at these beaver dams and studied them with satellite imagery and looked at the persistence of these beaver damming complexes. So
And, you know, in the book, one of the things I'm struck by is the diversity of people who are passionate about beavers and all the different ways that
Yeah.
people become passionate. But I don't think there's anybody, you mentioned earlier,
yeah,
Dorothy Richards, who had 14 beavers, 13 beavers.
yeah, she's coming up next.
Yeah, she's coming up next. And I just was astonished at the way in which those animals became part of her family and part of her life. And
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could educate the audience a bit about Beaver Sprite and how this evolved and what it teaches us about beavers.
Yeah, I would really love to talk
Do you
about
want
that.
to
In
talk
fact,
about more stuff here first?
well, no, I think,
Okay.
I mean, what's interesting about Lewis Henry Morgan is that he had incredible admiration from beavers, but at that point, you know, the country was building itself and doing what countries do. You know, the conversion of natural resources is the propelling force of empire, and that was going on in North America, and he was part of that, and he believed in that. So I think he was not a conservationist. He was, you know, it would be really interesting to have him in the room right now talking about beavers.
Right.
But it's hard, I think, to take people out of history.
Out of their historical context.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, he believed, I think, in what he was doing and the value of it, which is building railroads to mine, you know, all the
natural
all the
resources,
resources.
Midwest and the West.
yes. Yeah. So I think we need to leave Morgan in his time
Right.
and go forward, because I don't know that it's productive to sort of pull him out of that. But it
Okay.
is interesting because there are other people, when we talk about Dorothy Richards, like Enos Mills, who by 1913, he was Roosevelt's first forest spokesman, who did understand the value of beavers and was already saying, oh, here we are.
Right, just so
Okay.
people know.
Yeah.
So I think what I'm seeing is we really need a little screen there so
Yeah.
that we can see what's behind us. This is the first sort of real conversation we've done in a long
Oh,
time.
yeah,
And we have a few slides as prompts,
I can
right?
look
That's how
here.
we work it, and we print it out, but it's interesting. We are adapting and learning from our pandemic experience. So fire away.
Yeah. Yeah, so I had a lot of fun putting these slides together. So these are, and many of these are images from the book, but this is Dorothy Richards, who was really an extraordinary person. So she was born in Little Falls, grew up, and ended up serendipitously moving to the confluence of two streams. And when the Forest Service was looking for a place to release two beavers, they called up her husband, and just by coincidence, two beavers were released on her property, and she went down to observe them one day, saw what they were doing, and that was it. That was it. From that day on, she wrote in her memoir, she would go down every day to the pond. The next 40 years of her life were all about
She was
beavers.
beaver struck.
She was beaver struck. And thank goodness, because she actually made important contributions, we now know, including founding the first beaver sanctuary, Beaver Sprite, which still exists today. And I write about this because there was this wonderful moment. I'm literally at a wild fur auction in Herkimer, New York, leaving the wild fur auction, and this fur trapper asked me if I want to go to a beast feast. And I politely say, no, thank you. But he says it's near Little Falls, and my ears perk up because he's from there. And I say, did you ever hear of someone named, Dorothy Richards? And he says, oh, the beaver lady. And just coincidentally, he had as a kid, he'd gone to her house. His dad was a plumber, and dad had been asked to her house because the beavers had unscrewed the plumbing in the basement and had flooded it. And so his dad was there trying to fix the plumbing. But before they go down to the basement to deal with that, they're sitting there, and he's 8 years old. His dad's sitting in the chair like you and I are sitting, and the man recounted that a beaver walks out. He doesn't know what a beaver is. He said this animal walked out and starts pushing his father's chair. And then this old woman comes out and says, "You're sitting in the beaver's way. You have to move." So his father gets up and moves the chair, and the beaver just walks through. So that was Beaver Sprite, and he never forgot it.
So you went.
So I went and I found Beaver Sprite, and I found the people running the sanctuary. And this is an archival photograph that they shared with me. This is Dorothy having tea with Eager, her favorite beaver. But she wasn't, I think this was a setup photograph. It's a little unfair just to show this because she observed beavers. She actually convinced the state in 1938 to let her have 2 beaver kits in her house. Even then, beavers as wild animals, you were not allowed to have them in captivity, but the state made an exception for her. I don't think they would let anybody do that today, but anyway. So unless you're a wildlife rehabilitation trained licensed person. So she wrote a book about it. What's interesting to me, many things are interesting to me about Dorothy Richards, but one of the things that interested me is that she wrote about the emotional lives of beavers, and she was convinced that they had a sense of humor and other things about beavers, and she recorded this. And her observations were discounted. She was considered nutty. And I think because she was a self-trained naturalist, because she was female, and because she often took a very radical stance, she really wanted to educate the public about the value of beavers, because at that time, our cultural stance toward beavers was pretty much they had been a pelt and now they were a pest. There was really no value attributed to beavers the way we're starting to put a value on beavers now as, environmental restoration partners, keystone species, all these attributes that we now understand. We now understand how valuable they are, but very few people did back then. So in other words, the reason I put these pictures up here of Newbie on the other side is that Newbie is a rescue beaver. Has been taken in by a wildlife rescue place in Chelmsford.
Okay.
And what's interesting is that she's become a little bit of a viral sensation because she's awfully cute. And she loves this ball that she holds all the time. And in fact, they were worried because for a year she was not interested in sticks. She didn't seem to be wanting to be a beaver, like maybe a soccer player. I don't know, just not acting like a beaver. And then finally, recently, she has been interested in sticks. She's grown up a little bit. But what's interesting is she's clear separation between play and sticks. Sticks go one place, her beloved toys go another. So she's demonstrating some of the things that Dorothy Richards observed, that beavers are playful, they have a sense of humor. She plays tricks on her kind of handlers or whoever you call her, rehabilitator, manager, owner, whatever. So the point is, we are at a crossroads, at a revolution now, I think, in our understanding about animal behavior, the emotional cognition.
Yeah.
Researchers like Franz de Waal and many others are gaining attention with their incredible work on animals. And then you have Dorothy Richards, who a long time ago was really at the frontier of this, I think.
Right. And just because she was eccentric didn't make her crazy.
That's my position.
Right. Yeah.
I gave her a whole
I mean,
chapter.
You've got to admit that living with that many beavers she comes off as brilliant and eccentric.
Yeah, anyway, I could talk for a long time about Dorothy Richards. I won't, but I think it's worth reading Beaver Sprite if you're at all interested in beavers and visiting the sanctuary. It still exists. She donated something like 600 acres of land. Every penny she had went toward buying land for beavers. Pretty admirable.
It is. And, I was talking to Deb Farjan, my assistant, and she told me as a child she went to Beaver Sprite. and it clearly had a huge impact. So I think these things have depth that we can't quite imagine. And, you know, and clearly, was that Harlan who leaned?
No,
That was
no.
different, a different
No.
trapper.
And one thing, if I may, another reason I wanted to write about Dorothy Richards is I would discover in writing the book, there's almost a canon of writing about beavers in American nature writing. So The American Beaver and His Works by Morgan, then Enos Mills wrote a book in 1913 that really was, he was a proto-beaver believer. He wrote about how the beaver could save America. He was worried about
Them disappearing.
over extraction of our resources and them disappearing. And there have been other books. So it's interesting. There was Gray Owl, really Archie Bellany up in Canada. So there's been actually an interesting trajectory of books that have been published and forgotten, published and forgotten. And it's interesting to me that there's been this kind of amnesia about beavers. So
you're helping rediscover them.
well, I think it's really important to acknowledge the books that have come before.
Absolutely. And Beaver Sprite, I think was that reissued recently or? 'cause
Yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there are signs of progress.
yeah. And there are other books as well, other good books.
All right, so let's get back to some other people. I mean, one of the interesting things in the book was, I talked to you about this before, reading about, you mentioned the fur auctions, right? And the trappers and the people who manage beavers today. And in the book, there was a deep, deep respect for the knowledge these people had. And then as I read further and further, there was a sense of affection. And I'm sort of curious, these are not people who are getting rich by you know, they're not the John Jacob Astors, but it's a second, you know, it's two different views of how people who interact with beavers, both as commodity, in both cases as commodities, but, you know, Astor made his fortune on it, and the you know, 21st century fur traders are really keeping alive traditions and are extremely connected to the beavers. I was wondering if you could talk about that difference a little bit.
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, I put some slides together, I think, to show that I think it was really interesting to me to learn this deep history. Because what I would learn when I got to know some of the fur trappers like Herb Savansky that I profile in the book was their deep appreciation for this history and the extent to which they felt that they were keeping a cultural legacy alive. So I wanted to understand what was it that they felt was so important. And you know, I thought of a beaver hat. I thought of Daniel Boone, and I was completely mistaken. That was a raccoon.
I was gonna say that was
Yeah,
raccoon,
that was
right?
a raccoon. You know, the beaver hat, you have to think of Mr. Darcy on Bond Street in London, or George Washington. And even today, ultra-Orthodox, you know, Hasidics, that tall hat is made of beaver felt if they can get it. So beaver felt is still valued. And back in the 1500s, it was the Gore-Tex of its day in terms of, you know, a beaver hat was not just fashion, it was warm and waterproof. It was really valuable. So you have to remember that it was an important commodity. And then to think about back when beaver was a currency, that's why I put these tokens up, you know, that was the first currency of this country. But I think you're talking about what it was like to kind of encounter this culture. It was definitely intimidating for me. The first time I went into a fur trapper gathering, you can imagine I'm small. I obviously drive a Subaru. I'm a college professor. You know,
you think your own stereotype, right?
You know, but I would come to understand that actually we shared a lot of the same values when it came to valuing the wilderness or valuing the woods. Herb Savansky was somebody who just could be in the woods all day, could talk about beavers all day, unreservedly passionate about this animal. The difference was that he felt that when people had a beaver problem, when beavers were in the wrong place, his solution was, he felt he was helping people out by trapping the beaver and then utilizing it. So he didn't want to see that beaver get wasted. He was going to use the fur and the meat and everything else. And in the end, I felt I had to respect that. And then I thought he was really an amazing human being. I came to see him as an amazing human being. So in many ways, entering this world that was so different from any world I had known. Although I have to say, when you grow up on a farm, and I'd worked on a ranch, you know, when you farm, you're utilizing nature in a way.
Yeah.
Where's the line between using plants or farming, you know, goats or sheep, and then utilizing wild animals? Where do you draw that line? People draw it in different places.
Yeah.
I think I was probably more open to thinking about that.
Yeah, but it's the book oozes compassion for the different perspectives. And I thought that was what was most interesting, was that there was this commonality that goes through both time and space.
Well, and I have to say, I mean, I'm monitoring this growing beaver pond.
Behind your house?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And working with different researchers, and it's really exciting on a number of levels. It's a whole different story. But at one point, everybody said, well, wait, what are the beavers doing? And I said, well, we got to find out. And they said, well, how? And I said, well, I know how. And the reason I could get pictures of them is because I knew how to do a bait pile, and I knew how to draw them to the bait pile because I'd been hanging around with fur trappers.
Right.
And Herb had taught me how to think like a beaver. And, you know, I've got all these pictures of beavers because, you know, of everything he taught me. So that deep knowledge that he had of the animal, I'm really grateful to him for having taught that to me.
And that is a behavioral biologist trick as well. I remember when I was starting my PhD, a guy named Robin Dunbar, who had grown up in East Africa, and I was going out to study zebras, and he said, don't take any data the first year. And I looked at him like he was crazy. And he said, learn to think like a zebra. Learn to watch zebras. Learn to, you know, notice the little things, like how they use their ears to communicate with each other. You know, anybody who rides a horse is fully aware of how horses use theirs. But this idea that you learn to think like the animal, get inside of it, and then can understand its ecology and its behavior much more intuitively.
But it doesn't happen via GIS. It happens when you study.
You got to sit there and watch them.
Yeah, you got to spend time in the beaver pond.
Yeah. So it's hard work, but good work. So, you know, beavers have been iconic in our culture, but they were also iconic in Native American culture, which I think takes us to the next slide. Okay, well, it's changing. There we go.
Oh, here we are. Yeah.
And you open the book with the story of the Great Beaver.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the Great Beaver and why you chose that as it were to introduce beavers to your audience.
Yeah, well, that's a really great question. So, and these images, by the way, are images that Dr. Jordan Kennedy shared with me, and are of a beaver damming complex out in Montana. And I just want to point out that what you're looking at, what everyone's looking at here, is the complexity of, this is a beaver worked area of a creek, and all those blue lines are canals and overland trails. And so you can see, this is just in one season, because in this part of the world, beavers have to build every spring, because every year the washout from the floods in the spring,
Snow melt.
Yeah, the snow melt. So this is just one season of productivity. It's incredible. But Dr. Kennedy grew up in the Blackfeet reservation, and so she did her PhD research there and shared all these images with me. And she's the researcher that was studying in the Harvard soft math lab. And I mentioned earlier studying, I think, cracking the code of beaver intelligence. But the Great Beaver story that I use in the beginning of the book is from the Algonquian tradition. And there are many great beaver stories. So it's really important for me to say two things right up front. I'm not a scholar of indigenous cultures. I'm a writer, but I did a lot of research on this because I was fascinated by the extent to which there were so many different great beaver stories in different native cultures throughout the country and how different they were. So for the Algonquin peoples, the woodland people on the eastern seaboard and into the Great Lakes, in the woodland cultures where you have quite a number of beavers, there are often kind of not an ambivalent relationship toward beavers. I wouldn't say that, but that great beaver story, we'll talk about it in a minute, but hunting of beavers is allowed with strict protocols. But in contrast, out in something like Blackfeet territory, where you have arid northern plains culture, where the peoples were reliant upon the bison, reliant upon the grass, and there's a lot of drought, there were strict prohibitions against hunting beaver at all. And so you have very different attitudes towards the beaver depending upon the environments. And it has to do with an understanding of the beaver's role in managing the water. And so what this showed me very early on in my research was these stories were entertaining environmental parables that were about connectedness and about honoring proper relationships to the natural world, but they also were conveying what's now called IEK, indigenous ecological knowledge.
Yeah.
So there's very sophisticated understanding of the beaver's role as an ecosystem engineer, as a keystone species that's being conveyed through these stories. So once the kind of light bulb went on for me in the process of researching this book, that in some ways science was catching up with these stories, which are some of the oldest stories of our continent. And since the beaver made America, I thought, okay, this all fits. And
Right.
this story one of these stories has to open the book. And since the book is set in the East, it wouldn't make sense to open it with a Blackfeet story. That would seem kind of out of kilter. So I wanted to find a story from the East. And since the book is set in Connecticut, I found a story of beavers shaping the Connecticut River Valley. So in this wonderful story, for those of you who haven't read it, what happens is the great beaver comes to the Connecticut Valley and starts flooding it. And he just gets carried away and he just won't stop. He's just having such a great time. And the creator says, I mean, the humans are going crazy because they're going to flood out all their crops and their villages, and begs him to stop, and he won't. So the creator has to chase him down and try to discipline him. And it's a really interesting story because, of course, anybody listening to it knows that it's not the beaver who needs to be disciplined about greed and misbehavior. It's really humans. But so it's a kind of subversive environmental parable. It's a teaching story, but it's just wonderfully tricky. And I think the fact that it's full of humor and laughter and the beaver's kind of naughty is very much a story of the East. In contrast, in the Blackfeet tradition, the beaver bundle is the most revered, important teaching story. It's the origin of all their rituals. Beavers brought time, beavers brought tobacco, beavers brought all kinds of important knowledge. So it is not dealt with in that kind of a humorous way at all, right? So the beaver is a very revered teacher out in the arid northern
it's
plains.
arid, and as
Yeah.
you said, the dams get flooded out each year, so that
Yeah.
gets into the knowledge of what it takes to have a population. of
Yeah.
beavers.
So, I mean, I'm by no means an expert, but I did spend a lot of time immersing myself in this, in the study of this, because I found it really, really interesting, and just, it just seemed a perfect way to open the book.
As usually happens with us, we've talked too much, and we're going to have to get some questions in.
Oh,
So
great, great.
a very brief linkage of indigenous knowledge to the Great Drying.
Oh, yeah, quick.
So quick
Yeah.
Great Drying discussion.
Yeah.
Right, and then we'll sort of imagine Beaverland through some questions.
So just very briefly, the geologist, Dr. Ellen Wall, I think, is the one who coined this term, the Great Drying, but she calls 1600 to 1900 the Great Drying because of the absence of beavers. And the point is that when beavers were wiped out, that was really a period of intense environmental devastation. And that's widely recognized today because you can just see in this slide on the left, the kind of intense, this is a beaver worked wetland here, and you can see how much water is in the land. And without beavers, just imagine that as a straight river. A channelized river doesn't look anything like that. The kind of rivers and streams we often see out here in the East just don't look like that. And if you just think about biodiversity for a minute, you start to understand why beaver altered streams and wetlands are the coral reefs of North America. So much biodiversity.
Because they create all these complex habitats.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the, 15 times more plankton and microbial life just in the water, and it just goes up from that.
And you mentioned the way in which beavers have altered the landscape for 70 years up at Hubbard Brook.
Yeah.
And sort of thinking about what the future of a beaver land could look like. How can you connect those two things, right? And what you've learned about beavers, and sort of close your eyes and think about what the future of landscape looks like if we were to actually go back to 150 million beavers on the landscape?
Well, I've done some presentations with Dr. Emily Fairfax, who's done some really exciting work out west with looking at the ways in which beavers can be used for wildfire mitigation. And not just to repair wildfire damaged areas, but actually to change fire behavior, which is really interesting. So this is a slide from Colorado. And this is actually after a wildfire has ravaged Colorado. If you look at the mountains on the side, you can actually see that that's fire burned. And then this is Beaver Refugia. And I think if you look at that, you can see the tremendous power of resilience and restoration that beavers can bring. It's just extraordinary. And it's something that we can harness. And that's the other thing that I wanted really to share with readers in my book, was that beavers are such a story of hope and resiliency in our moment. They're a climate action plan, just
in and of themselves.
In and of themselves.
Yeah.
We don't have to do much besides give them space and get out of their way. But there are many, many exciting programs working to bring them, like the program in the Upper Milwaukee that I write about in the book, where do I have a minute?
Go ahead.
So there's this program in the
We'll keep people.
Upper Milwaukee, very quickly, if I may share this. They have studied and estimate that if they bring beavers into the upper watershed, where they will not create human beaver conflicts, this is open land, ready for beavers, within 25 years, they can create 1.7 trillion gallons of water storage a year. That's water storage with a dollar value of something like $3 million a year. So there's real money being attached to the value that beavers can bring. And because of that, towns, cities, sewage company departments, municipalities are saying, hey, what can we do? Can we get these highly trained engineers to work for us for free?
Right. Right.
Because
the maintenance costs are low.
maintenance costs are low. And I think I've heard very highly trained engineers and people working in environmental restoration say, without blinking an eye, often beavers can do it 100 times cheaper than an engineered solution. And they don't blink an eye, and they are not kidding. Not everywhere, but in a lot of places. So
That's what the future looks like.
one would hope.
One would hope. All right, so let's entertain a few questions. I'm going to repeat your questions because that way people out there can hear them. Question in the front here. So how long do beavers live on average?
Average is 12 years.
Not bad for a rodent.
But I mean, there are a lot of things that can prematurely end a beaver's life, but without predation or getting hit by a car or something like that, 12 years.
pond near my house, and there were beavers in the pond, adult beavers, and just 2 weeks ago, my daughter and I were walking, and it was frozen ice on the pond. And all of a sudden, there were 6 babies.
Adorable. I am going to ask for no follow-up questions because we're short on questions. Gentleman there.
You showed that of
Astor.
there's a very good focus
Yeah.
So there's a book about Astor by
Peter Stark.
Peter Stark, which talks about the capitalism. I'm going to leave you to one statement because we have a lot of people who want to ask questions. There was a question up in the back. Yes. Is that man? Yes. Hi. Go ahead. Yes.
So, years ago, in the New Orleans area, tunneling out, ruining land, property, and try to balance the positive nature of the behavior of the beaver against their cousin, the nutria, that rodent.
So the question is, nutria have a tendency to cut holes through dams and embankments, and how do you balance the value of a beaver, also a rodent, with the value of nutria, also a rodent?
Well, I can't really answer to the nutria, but just, I think you've asked a good question. Maybe I can answer it in terms of beavers, because I think there are places where beavers are going to cut down trees to do what they need to do. And sometimes people don't want those trees cut down. And other times they're going to want to try to bring water to a low-lying area. So maybe that town wants a soccer field there and they don't want water there. So that's a conflict. And I think it's a case-by-case situation. You can't always choose to have the soccer field somewhere else. So there are some really good options for managing water. There's a whole, in fact, we put together a page of resources here.
Yep.
The Beaver Institute in not too far away in Massachusetts has a whole site of resources for this. But if beavers are threatening a road or threatening to flood areas where a community doesn't want water, often the water level in a pond can be maintained with something called a pond leveler. Essentially, you make a permanent hole in the dam, you put a long corrugated pipe through it, and it's a permanent leak. And the beavers get used to that if it's done well. And it's really been shown to work. You know, I call beavers the Shiva of the animal world, because they you know, they're gonna take down trees and they're gonna make a pond. So it's, you can't have one without the other. But there is an interesting myth about beavers, which is that they always have to be eating trees. They don't continuously bite and eat trees to keep their teeth short. They only, they actually grind their teeth, like sit around, grind their teeth like this in idle moments to keep them dull.
Mhm.
They do have ever-growing teeth, and they also only live on bark in times like this when there aren't aquatic plants. So the beavers near me are ravenous right now. I call where they're living the beaver cafeteria. They've taken down like 3 or 4 trees. It's incredible to get the underlying bark, the cambium. There's not a lot of nutrition in that. They would much rather eat aquatic plants, tubers from water lilies or cattails. If you have Phragmites, pull it out and try and get some cattails going, because the cattails have a lot of starch.
Yeah, big
They need,
tubers.
yeah, big tubers. So they actually, and you can also protect trees that you want to keep beavers away from with wire
All right, and I'm going to pick a.
Okay,
We're,
yeah, another
our
one.
technology is working, yay.
Okay,
Sort of on that, when you're doing wetland restoration, are there certain species, birches or aspens or things that you can plant to encourage beavers to be part of that restoration project?
absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on where you live, but I know down in the Chesapeake, they do a lot with fast-growing willows, aspen. In Connecticut, they do a lot with fast-growing willows. And in fact, the way the beavers tend to graze on them, they come back more thickly.
right.
So
They coppice them and.
they coppice them and they come back. So, and they do that out west as well. So that can be a really great way. If you want beavers in your community, plant some food for them, scrubby things. They'll love that.
So that's a very positive note, and it's a few minutes past 8, so I'm going to respect people wanting to go to dinner on a Friday night. First of all, thank you again. We could do this all night, as you can tell. It's lots of fun. So thank you, Leila.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming here. Thank you all for being here, even if you're not coming here. Again, we will have the Tom Wessel reading on April 20th. I don't think that sign up is up yet. And then May 11th, the hybrid Cary Science conversation with Jane Lucas. Have a wonderful weekend. Enjoy the warm weather, and remember that April showers, etc. So thank you all for coming. Thank you.